If there was one opening in gaming which really did have the weight of the world on its shoulders, it was without doubt Metal Gear Solid 2's Tanker chapter. For many, back in 2001, Metal Gear Solid 2 wasn't just a next-gen game, it was the next-gen game, the title which promised to take cinematic gaming experiences to a whole new level, something it delivered in spades. With that being the case, in this video I want to talk more about how it managed to do just that, as well as why, in its own way, it's some of the best stealth action the Metal Gear series has to offer. If the original Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear Solid 2's Plant chapter are novels, large chunks of story taking place over a significant number of hours, then Metal Gear Solid 2's Tanker chapter is the quintessential short story. Whether you've played one, many, or none of the games in the series, you'll still be able to get a lot out of its wonderfully simple setup, one that can be easily understood by anyone, no matter their history with Metal Gear Solid. Solid Snake's goal isn't an altogether complicated one: infiltrate a US Navy ship and then photograph a new amphibious anti-Metal Gear unit so that the photos can then be released to the public.
Look, Snake, all we need is the photographic evidence of Metal Gear. As long as we have those, we can put it online and blow the whole thing wide open. So no pyrotechnics, okay?
All right, I'll do my best.
Although that mission does become a little bit trickier soon after Snake sets foot on the ship, as Russian soldiers take the vessel by force.
Russians?
You sure?
No Marine barber touched that head of hair.
But his aim ultimately remains the same regardless: get the photos and get out. It's a fairly straightforward premise, no doubt, but by the end of the chapter, that simple setup does quickly blossom into something far more involved, with many questions left unanswered. Who is Ocelot working for? Is that really Liquid taking control of him via his transplanted arm? Did Snake survive the opening chapter? To name just a few. The narrative simplicity in the Tanker's first half, combined with more depth in its second, is genius. The easily understood opening, one with high stakes, but stakes that are also laid out clearly and succinctly, does a great job of drawing you in regardless of your prior experience with the franchise. And the opening up of a number of new plot threads at the chapter's conclusion means that by the time you lose control of Snake, that simplicity has been replaced with a more traditional Metal Gear story. Accessibility of narrative was clearly a key consideration for series director Hideo Kojima and team from the outset, with new players given time to gain a better understanding of context and characters before the story becomes more complex later on. There are no long-winded allusions to Shadow Moses, an event those new to the series won't have witnessed, no 20-minute long complicated philosophical musings about the nature of love and life and death on the battlefield. At its core, described in its simplest terms, this is the story of a good guy trying to sneak past bad guys to take pictures of an enormous robot. It's a tale which is also paced extremely confidently. If it were a full game, then we'd have no doubt been exposed to some of Kojima's more indulgent storytelling techniques, long cutscenes punctuated by short gameplay sections, similar to the end of the Plant chapter. But during the Tanker segment, there's no time for that, nor would it have been sensible to structure it that way regardless, given that this section of the game needed to attract a new audience as much as it also needed to impress series veterans. The classic Metal Gear story is present and correct, but exposition is delivered to you at a far faster pace than its predecessor, or indeed later in the same game during the Plant chapter. That may not sound like an appealing prospect to some of you. After all, the often extremely complex plot is one loved by many, but in the context of the Tanker, the snappier pace and simpler storytelling combine perfectly. The chapter begins with 10 or so minutes of cutscenes, including what was, back in 2001, one of the most cinematic ever seen in gaming, as Snake bungees down from the George Washington Bridge onto the Tanker. "10 minutes sounds like a long time, but Metal Gear Solid 2 does a great job of switching between cutscenes and codec calls to help keep things interesting. And none of that time is wasted either. You learn about the mission and the story behind it, that Revolver Ocelot has a hand in whatever's going on, and witness Sergei Galukovich and his men take control of the Tanker. There's even a few gameplay hints thrown in for good measure. Next comes a long period of uninterrupted gameplay as you head to the ship's bridge, after which there's some shorter exposition on either side of the boss fight with Olga, followed by 2 more substantial gameplay segments before the final flourish at the tanker's conclusion in the form of a much longer scene similar to its opening. Other than the scenes which bookend the chapter, you're never forced to put the controller down for long at all, and the result is a dense, tightly packed Metal Gear experience which constantly keeps you on your toes. That idea of packing as much as possible into a short runtime extends to the tanker's gameplay as well. The environment as a whole is very much the ultimate Metal Gear playground, one which offers a myriad of ways to experiment in an extremely condensed space. Much like the chapter's pacing in terms of plot, its level design and gameplay also serve to keep things moving forward quickly, and in general it's a much more one-directional affair than much of the rest of the series. Metal Gear Solid 2's gameplay is introduced in its simplest terms on the tanker's deck. It's a large open space, the most open in the entire chapter, housing only a few guards who are extremely easy to sneak up on. Here you can get to grips with the basics, traversing the environment, using weapons and holding up guards without any real threat of ever being discovered. It also does a good job of creating the illusion of the tanker being a less linear environment than it actually is, with there being 2 ways to enter the ship's interior. What I love about the choice of doors is that you're actually introduced to a different mechanic depending on which one you choose. Both feature a patrolling guard, but the left-hand route focuses on the idea of lockers and how they can be used. No, Solid Snake, not like that. Please, not like that. While the right-hand route demonstrates that shadows are now an important part of stealth. It's a very clever idea. Both mechanics were at the time new and exciting, and this way, whichever direction you choose to take, you'll be greeted by something entirely new to the series. Once inside the tanker, the opportunities to interact with the environment and with the enemies who inhabit it are endless. If the tanker's plot is designed to remove as much complexity from the story as possible, at least during the chapter's early stages, then the interior of the tanker is designed to show off just how varied Metal Gear Solid 2's gameplay has the potential to be, and how it made the world itself feel so much more realistic than almost any other game on the market at the time. That realism begins with the guards themselves. They can be held up and forced to relinquish whatever items they are carrying, as well as their dog tags, and every guard has their own name. Not only does that lend a sense of humanity to enemies who could otherwise be considered to be fairly blank slates, it also works incredibly well alongside the differing reactions they display when being held up.
Freeze. Freeze.
Don't kill me.
Freeze.
No! If you're going to shoot, then
Each feels like their own man, and thus seems more threatening as a result. It creates the illusion of agency. With this increased focus on the guard's personality comes a more defined presence within the map. In the original Metal Gear Solid, if guards were killed, they would quickly blink out of existence, but in 2, whether unconscious or deceased, their body remains exactly where it is, forcing you to use lockers to safely dispose of them or hide them where other enemies won't tread. If you're discovered, they will radio in for help, and that can also be avoided if you shoot their radio out of their hands quickly enough. If they do manage to call for backup, those same lockers used to hide bodies can also conceal Snake, and you're even given a cinematic picture-in-picture shot as guards sweep the area you're hiding in. They also communicate constantly, which again helps increase immersion. Their names and realistic behaviour help define the individual, and their chatter helps define the group, and they even upgrade their equipment should you cause too much of a disturbance. Rather than being little more than individual entities who will occasionally work together during an alert, every single detail is designed around the idea of the guards reacting to events appropriately, of them being part of a living, breathing unit which reacts on the fly to whatever happens around them. The areas those guards patrol are also masterclasses in interactivity. There are so many small touches throughout the map that it's absolutely possible you will miss more of them than you manage to find. Pipes and fire extinguishers can be shot to produce plumes of steam, helping you gain an advantage over the more tactically astute guards. Glass can be shot and will eventually shatter. Bottles and televisions break differently depending on where you shoot them. Ice cubes melt, bags of flour drain, and locker doors can be kicked off their hinges. By far my favourite detail is the melons in the storeroom. Shoot a few before one of the guards comes in to catch 40 winks, and he'll actually notice that they've been smashed. To some of you watching, what I've just listed may sound like quite inconsequential elements, but at the time of 2's release, they were astonishing. Games simply didn't feature anything close to this level of interactivity when it came to the little details, and even nowadays, there aren't that many titles which manage to replicate it either. It's a design philosophy similar in its own way to the left and right doors I spoke about earlier. There, you're guaranteed to discover something new whichever direction you head in, and by including so many smaller touches in such a confined space, Kojima almost guaranteed that even the most inattentive gamer will notice at least one or two of them and rightfully be blown away. Metal Gear Solid 2 even encourages you to think outside the box during its boss battle with Olga. She uses a tarp and lights to her advantage, and the game makes it very clear that you can interact with them as well. If the spotlight is causing a problem, for example, you can shoot it out. These additions aren't just included to make the battle a trickier one, they're also a nudge and a wink in your direction, a hint that you need to be more like Olga if you aren't already, thinking tactically about your surroundings and how they can be used to turn the tide of battle in your favour. Last but certainly not least, I also want to touch on the way Metal Gear Solid 2 uses the chapter to toy with your expectations. As this video is focused on the tanker, I'm not going to go too much into events later in the game, but suffice to say, the way it plays out works as a great setup for the Big Shell chapter which follows. When control switches to Raiden, you aren't meant to feel like a super spy, a soldier of near unimaginable talent. You're meant to feel out of your depth. Raiden is a rookie, a man trained not on battlefields but in simulations, and so he essentially acts as a reflection of you the player, who learned how to be Solid Snake by playing a video game. With that being the case, letting you take control of Snake, but only for the briefest of moments, is brilliant. For a short while, you're able to pick up where you left off after the first game, or quickly learn the ropes in a less challenging setting if you're new to the series, and you soon begin to feel rather powerful, like you can breeze through whatever the game throws at you without so much as breaking a sweat. But at the end of the chapter, Snake has ultimately failed to stop Metal Gear Ray from being taken, and it looks like he may not survive the chapter at all.
No problems. Proceeding as planned, sir.
Suddenly, you transition from feeling empowered to feeling weak. Not only did you fail to prevent a catastrophe, but your actions may have also resulted in the death of Snake. It pulls the rug out from under you and makes you feel vulnerable, which is exactly the state Kojima wants you to be in when you take control of Raiden. This even extends to the contrast between the two characters' first boss battles. Snake manages to take down Olga, and the following boss fight tasks you with trying to kill Fortune as Raiden, with your attempts ultimately proving futile. Metal Gear Solid 2's opening does everything it can to encourage pride before the fall, and it's extremely successful in doing just that. Once the tanker chapter has concluded, the setting changes to the Big Shell and the story becomes Raiden's rather than Snake's. It has remained a controversial decision ever since Metal Gear Solid 2 was released, and to this day I still consider the way Konami kept it under wraps to be quite extraordinary. But regardless of how you feel about the rest of the game, there's no denying that the tanker chapter that kicks everything off is completely and utterly engrossing. It does so much in such a short space of time, both in terms of story and gameplay, and it's a tale that feels satisfying and complete whether you continue on to the Big Shell or not. So if you've an hour to spare, why not take Metal Gear Solid 2's tanker chapter for another spin and relive one of the best short stories in all of gaming. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and super spies. If you enjoyed it, please do consider liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.